Nobody noticed when Aiko Yamashita stepped off the wrong jeepney, except the man who stopped speaking mid-sentence when he heard her accent asking for directions she could not pronounce correctly. Aiko was not supposed to be alone. She carried no entourage, no translator, no security, only a folded paper address and a phone that had lost signal minutes earlier. The itinerary prepared in Tokyo had dissolved into noise, traffic, heat, and unfamiliar smiles. She did not know Manila forgives confusion quickly, but remembers dignity longer. What followed was not help in the polite diplomatic sense, but something less predictable and harder to document. Within an hour, 3 strangers would make a decision without knowing her title, her lineage, or her importance. By nightfall, someone inside the Japanese embassy would panic quietly. By morning, a story would exist that no official press release would ever acknowledge. This story does not begin with rescue. It begins with trust offered too early, accepted too fast, and tested in ways no protocol could survive. Everything that followed would quietly challenge assumptions about power, anonymity, kindness, and the unrecorded choices ordinary people make when no one is watching, and history never bothers correcting itself. The first stranger was Ramon Ibarra, a middle-aged electrical technician who had learned Japanese from old factory manuals and late-night television reruns. He recognized the cadence before the words made sense. Ramon did not ask who Aiko was. He asked where she was trying to go, and whether she had eaten. When she hesitated, he interpreted silence as danger rather than arrogance. He bought her water without permission and spoke slowly, embarrassed by his own confidence. Ramon believed Manila was a test city, one that measured how people behaved when rules collapsed. He had failed it before. This time, he decided to pass. He waved down a tricycle, negotiated a price that excluded explanations, and placed himself between her and curiosity. Aiko noticed he never touched her arm. She noticed he stood slightly ahead, as if absorbing risk. Neither mentioned fear. Neither mentioned misunderstanding. They spoke about weather, trains, and food portions. That conversation was not small talk. It was reconnaissance. By the time they reached a crowded terminal, Ramon had already decided not to leave until certainty replaced chance. That decision would later cost him 3 missed jobs, 1 reprimand, and something he would never regret. At the terminal, uncertainty multiplied. Schedules contradicted themselves. Destinations shifted names. Aiko realized the address on her paper no longer matched anything spoken aloud. This was when the second stranger entered without introduction. Liza Cruz sold prepaid SIM cards from a folding table and watched people the way card players watched hands. She noticed posture before panic and calm before deceit. Liza recognized foreign fear because she had worn it herself years earlier in Osaka, undocumented and invisible. She approached with a practiced smile and asked Aiko a question in English that required no answer. Permission arrived through eye contact alone. Liza replaced Aiko's useless SIM with a working one, refused payment, and typed a number Aiko did not recognize. The call was not to an embassy, a hotel, or authority. It was to Liza's cousin Paulo, a university security officer who understood silence better than instructions. Liza never explained why she trusted Paulo. She simply said he was careful. When the phone connected, Aiko heard reassurance she could not translate but fully understood. The situation was no longer accidental. It was now intentional, shaped by people who believed safety was a shared responsibility, not a delegated one. Paulo never came. He sent someone else. The third stranger was Miriam Velasco, a graduate student researching informal transport networks, currently writing a thesis nobody would fund. Miriam knew which routes vanished after sunset and which drivers remembered faces. She arrived carrying a backpack filled with notebooks, chargers, and assumptions she was willing to discard. Miriam did not ask Aiko her name. She asked how long she planned to stay lost. The question reframed everything. Aiko answered honestly, Miriam nodded, adjusted her plan, and canceled dinner with someone she no longer trusted. What Miriam brought was not transport but structure. She created a moving perimeter using conversations, eye contact, and intentional pauses. She positioned Ramon as familiarity, Liza as legitimacy, and herself as continuity. Aiko observed how decisions were made collectively without meetings or authority. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Each stop reduced exposure while increasing commitment. They avoided landmarks. They avoided uniforms. They avoided explanations. Miriam documented nothing, yet remembered everything. She believed stories lost power when recorded too early. As they moved, Aiko realized she was not being escorted. She was being integrated. That distinction unsettled her more than danger ever could, because integration implied responsibility in both directions. Responsibility became unavoidable when Aiko's phone finally received the missed calls. Messages arrived without punctuation, escalating from concern to alarm. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched Ramon argue gently with a driver about routes that no map displayed. She listened to Liza warn a stranger away using humor sharpened into threat. She saw Miriam calculate risk using nothing but instinct and context. Aiko understood then that disclosure would change the dynamic. Names introduce hierarchies. Titles distort behavior. She chose delay. That choice was not deceit. It was observation. She wanted to know how help functioned without incentive. The group reached a quiet cafe where decisions could slow without stopping. Aiko ordered food she could not pronounce and ate without ceremony. The others spoke about unrelated things, carefully avoiding questions. This restraint felt intentional, respectful, and rare. When Aiko excused herself to make a call, she stood outside and spoke softly in Japanese, confirming she was safe without explaining how. The response was relief layered with confusion. She returned inside knowing something irreversible had already occurred. Trust, once extended without conditions, demands repayment in truth. She would have to decide when to deliver it, and how much damage honesty would cause. The call from the embassy arrived while coffee cooled untouched. Aiko listened without interrupting, absorbing the procedural panic disguised as professionalism. She was instructed to remain where she was and wait for extraction. She agreed without committing. After the call, she did not announce anything. Instead, she asked Ramon why he learned Japanese. His answer involved redundancy notices, factory closures, and curiosity that survived disappointment. She asked Liza why she sold SIM cards instead of leaving again. Liza cited visas, mothers, and unfinished business. She asked Miriam why she studied systems nobody respected. Miriam replied that invisible systems kept cities alive. These answers were not confessions. They were declarations of values. Aiko realized that revealing her identity would reframe those values under pressure. The help she received would be reassigned motives. Gratitude would become obligation. She delayed again. When the embassy vehicle arrived nearby, unmarked but obvious, Aiko did something unexpected. She declined immediate departure. She cited confusion, fatigue, and preference. The official voice on the phone hardened. Protocol does not negotiate. Aiko ended the call politely. The others noticed nothing but the shift in her posture. They did not ask. Manila, she understood now, respected boundaries spoken quietly. The question was whether institutions would do the same once she crossed them. Time extended beyond planning. The group relocated once more, not to hide, but to breathe. They chose a neighborhood where familiarity outweighed curiosity. Here, Aiko observed a different Manila, one governed by recognition rather than anonymity. People nodded at Ramon. Someone teased Liza. Miriam borrowed a charger without asking. No one asked Aiko anything. That silence carried dignity. Aiko contemplated the paradox. In her world, protection followed status. Here, protection followed presence. When she finally spoke her name fully, it landed without impact. Yamashita meant nothing here. The others acknowledged it politely and continued their conversation. Relief and disappointment arrived together. She then clarified what the embassy knew but the city did not. She explained lineage without titles, obligation without ceremony. The reaction was not shock. It was irritation, directed not at her, but at the situation. Ramon frowned at the inconvenience. Liza cursed softly about paperwork. Miriam asked whether Aiko trusted the embassy to understand what had happened. Aiko hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Miriam proposed an alternative. Delay extraction by hours, not to escape, but to ensure context survived contact. Aiko agreed. For the first time that day, the decision belonged entirely to her, shaped by people who would never benefit from it. The hours that followed were not dramatic. They were instructive. Aiko accompanied Liza through transactions where trust replaced receipts. She watched Ramon repair a faulty connection for someone who could not pay. She listened to Miriam challenge assumptions about legality and legitimacy. These moments carried weight because no one performed them. They simply occurred. Aiko understood that stories often distort kindness by compressing it into highlights. This was different. It was sustained, mundane, and therefore powerful. When the embassy called again, Aiko answered. She explained where she was, who she was with, and why immediate removal would erase essential understanding. Silence followed. Then negotiation. Titles surfaced. Authority attempted to reassert itself. Aiko responded with clarity rather than defiance. She requested time, not permission. She was granted neither, but took both. Meanwhile, Miriam contacted Paulo, who arrived quietly and assessed without commentary. He confirmed safety, context, and credibility. His presence altered calculations on both sides. When Paulo spoke to the embassy, his language was measured, procedural, and firm. He did not disclose names. He did not dramatize. He translated values into risk assessments institutions understood. By evening, extraction became scheduled rather than demanded. Aiko watched the transition with mixed emotion. The system had adapted, but only after being forced to recognize informal competence it usually ignored. Extraction did not end the story. It complicated it. At the embassy, gratitude was formalized and sanitized. Statements were drafted that reduced uncertainty to inconvenience. Names were recorded inaccurately. Intentions were misinterpreted. Aiko corrected what she could and ignored the rest. She insisted on meeting the three strangers again under conditions that preserved equality. Arrangements were made reluctantly. When they met, no cameras were present. Gifts were refused. Apologies were exchanged in both directions. Aiko articulated what she had learned without romanticizing it. She acknowledged risk without inflating heroism. Ramon listened with discomfort. Liza deflected with humor. Miriam asked whether anything would change. That question lingered. Aiko knew institutional memory favored simplicity. She promised nothing she could not deliver. Instead, she asked permission to carry the story accurately, without names if preferred. All three agreed. Anonymity preserved truth better than recognition. Before leaving, Aiko requested something unusual. She asked for a list of unspoken rules. The ones that governed behavior when maps failed. Ramon offered one about standing between strangers and threat. Liza added one about refusing payment when dignity was at stake. Miriam contributed one about delaying documentation until meaning stabilized. Aiko memorized them. On the flight home, she drafted nothing official. She wrote a private account intended to outlast policy cycles. She understood now that being lost had been the most instructive appointment she would ever keep. Back in Japan, the narrative shifted immediately. Advisors reframed events as logistical misalignment. Security reviews multiplied. Recommendations hardened. Aiko participated without surrendering the truth. She introduced language that acknowledged informal systems without validating disorder. Resistance followed. Institutions prefer predictable partners. Manila, in this story, was neither predictable nor simple. Aiko insisted on preserving that complexity. When she proposed a cultural exchange initiative based on informal civic competence, the room reacted cautiously. When she cited unnamed individuals whose judgment surpassed protocols, skepticism surfaced. She did not argue. She waited. Over months, small decisions accumulated. Funding was redirected. Research invitations expanded. Miriam received an email offering access without expectation. Ramon's factory received upgraded documentation written in clearer Japanese. Liza's cousin Paolo was invited to consult on urban resilience quietly. None of this was publicized. That was intentional. Aiko understood visibility could corrode authenticity. She maintained contact indirectly, through intermediaries who respected boundaries. The story circulated privately among those who recognized its implications. It challenged assumptions about who protected whom, and how. Years later, during a speech unrelated to Manila, Aiko paused unexpectedly. She referenced getting lost once, without details. Those who knew understood. Those who did not dismissed it as metaphor. Both reactions were acceptable. The impact had already occurred, distributed across decisions nobody traced back to a single afternoon. That was the point. Manila had taught her that influence, like kindness, works best when it refuses attribution. Ramon noticed change before recognition. Work orders arrived with better instructions. Miscommunications declined. Someone in management began asking questions instead of issuing directives. He never connected it to that afternoon. He simply adjusted his expectations. Liza observed shifts more subtly. Fewer interrogations. Smoother renewals. A sense that someone far away had recalibrated a lens. Miriam experienced the most visible change. Her research gained legitimacy without losing independence. Invitations came with fewer conditions. She remained cautious. Systems accept critique temporarily, then attempt absorption. Miriam resisted by staying mobile. None of them spoke publicly about the incident. Silence preserved agency. Occasionally, they received updates through oblique channels. A grant here. A regulation adjustment there. The story functioned like a ghost in the system, influencing outcomes without demanding acknowledgement. Aiko followed these developments from a distance, aware of the ethical tension. Intervention without visibility risked paternalism. Withdrawal risked abandonment. She balanced carefully. When asked privately whether the experience had altered her view of diplomacy, she answered honestly. Diplomacy, she said, begins before representation and continues after authority leaves. That statement circulated without attribution. It resonated because it named something familiar but rarely validated. The afternoon in Manila did not become legend. It became reference. That distinction mattered. Legends inspire. References instruct. Aiko preferred instruction. It lasted longer, traveled further, and demanded less from those who carried it forward quietly. Years later, a crisis tested whether the lesson endured. A typhoon disrupted infrastructure beyond projections. Formal channels stalled. Informal networks responded immediately. Coordination occurred without centralized command. International observers struggled to map accountability. Aiko recognized the pattern. She intervened strategically, not by issuing directives, but by protecting space for informal competence to operate without obstruction. She leveraged relationships cultivated quietly over time. Aid flowed where it was needed, not where it was visible. The approach frustrated some allies. It saved time. Afterward, reports attempted to reconcile outcomes with procedures. They failed. Aiko resisted correction. She cited uncertainty as an asset rather than a flaw. Privately, she contacted Miriam, who declined involvement but offered analysis. Ramon contributed through his union. Liza facilitated communication without appearing on any list. The crisis passed. Evaluations credited coordination improvements without naming sources. Aiko accepted that invisibility was the cost of effectiveness. She reflected on how being lost had inverted her understanding of control. Loss of control had produced clarity. She did not seek to replicate the experience. She institutionalized its principles instead. Meanwhile, in Manila, life continued without reference to her. That continuity validated everything. The city had not needed her presence to function. It had simply allowed her to witness something already working. The lesson endured precisely because it was never framed as extraordinary. It was ordinary competence responding to unplanned demand. That, Aiko understood, was the most reliable form of resilience any society possessed. The story might have ended there, but history rarely respects neat conclusions. A journalist uncovered fragments through unrelated research. Patterns emerged. Questions followed. Aiko was asked to comment. She declined interviews, citing respect for privacy. Speculation filled the gap. Names were guessed incorrectly. Locations were misidentified. The truth remained intact because it refused clarification. Ramon heard rumors and laughed them off. Liza ignored them entirely. Miriam published a paper that indirectly addressed the phenomenon without narrative embellishment. The journalist moved on. Aiko considered whether silence was still ethical. She concluded that protection sometimes required withholding affirmation. Public recognition could invite replication without understanding. She chose restraint. Instead, she adjusted policy language further, embedding flexibility into rigid frameworks. These changes went unnoticed by most. They mattered when tested. Aiko's advisors eventually stopped questioning the origin of her convictions. Results silenced inquiry. She continued to carry the folded paper address from that day, now worn and illegible. It reminded her that clarity does not always come from preparation. Sometimes it arrives through interruption. Manila had interrupted her trajectory without altering her destination. It had refined it. The difference was subtle but permanent. She never framed the experience as personal transformation. That would center the wrong subject. The transformation belonged to how she recognized competence, trusted discretion, and valued the decisions people make when no one is watching them closely. Ramon retired earlier than planned. He spent time mentoring apprentices who asked why he emphasized judgment over rules. He never told them about Aiko. He spoke instead about moments when hesitation costs more than action. Liza expanded her business carefully, keeping it small enough to remain human. She trained others to read situations before transactions. Miriam finished her doctorate and refused several prestigious appointments. She chose advisory roles that allowed movement. Occasionally, their paths crossed again, unannounced and unremarked. They shared food, not stories. The absence of narrative preserved integrity. None of them sought validation. They had lived the outcome. Meanwhile, Aiko assumed greater responsibility at home. Her decisions reflected accumulated insight rather than singular experience. Observers attributed her effectiveness to discipline and foresight. Few suspected it traced back to a missed jeepney and a dead phone. When asked privately whether she ever regretted delaying extraction, she answered without hesitation. Regret requires harm. What she experienced had produced understanding without injury. That was rare. She acknowledged the risk, but dismissed fear as insufficient reason to avoid learning. The city that day had not treated her as special. That neutrality had been the gift. It allowed her to be present without distortion. Presence, she believed, was the beginning of accountability. Everything that followed depended on that initial condition being met without expectation. Manila had offered it freely. She had accepted it responsibly. The rest unfolded as consequence rather than design. In policy circles, an unnamed case study circulated, stripped of narrative, focused on outcomes. Analysts debated its implications. Some dismissed it as anomaly. Others recognized scalability in principles, not procedures. ICO monitored the discourse without intervention. Arguments revealed more about the participants than the case. Those seeking control found ambiguity threatening. Those valuing adaptability found validation. The debate itself signaled progress. Years earlier, such a case would have been excluded entirely. Now it provoked conversation. ICO considered that sufficient. Meanwhile, Manila continued evolving, indifferent to external interpretation. Informal networks adapted to new pressures. Old routes vanished. New ones emerged. The people who had helped her remained nodes rather than leaders. That suited them. Leadership attracts scrutiny. Nodes distribute resilience. ICO internalized that distinction deeply. When she mentored younger officials, she emphasized listening for what was not documented. She encouraged time spent without agenda. Some complied. Others did not. Outcomes varied accordingly. The lesson resisted formalization. That was acceptable. It had never been intended as doctrine. It functioned as orientation. Lostness had recalibrated her compass. She no longer equated direction with certainty. That shift altered how she approached complexity everywhere. Manila had not solved a problem for her. It had revealed how problems solve themselves when allowed to. That insight accompanied her into every negotiation, every crisis, every quiet decision that never made headlines but shaped lives nonetheless. One final exchange occurred years later, unplanned and brief. ICO received a message through an intermediary. Ramon was ill. The message contained no request. She responded by arranging something that appeared unrelated. Equipment arrived at a local clinic. Training followed. No explanation accompanied it. Ramon never learned the source. He recovered partially and returned to mentoring. The circle closed without ceremony. Liza heard about it secondhand and nodded. Miriam noted the pattern and smiled. The story had completed itself without demanding recognition. ICO reflected on closure. Closure, she realized, was a narrative convenience. Real experiences integrated rather than concluded. They informed behavior indefinitely. The day she got lost never receded into memory. It remained active, shaping choices quietly. When she eventually stepped away from public responsibility, commentators cited legacy initiatives. They missed the subtlety. Her most significant contribution could not be named. It existed in decisions made differently because of one afternoon that refused simplification. Manila had not left her speechless. It had recalibrated her language. She spoke with greater precision afterward, aware of what words concealed as much as what they revealed. That awareness protected her from arrogance. It reminded her that competence often operates below visibility thresholds. Respecting that reality required discipline. She practiced it until it became instinct. That, more than any title, defined her authority. If this story survives, It will do so imperfectly. Details will blur. Motives will be assigned inaccurately. That is inevitable. What matters is the principle embedded within it. Help does not require comprehension of importance. Safety does not require control. Dignity does not require permission. These truths resist institutional capture. They emerge in moments when individuals choose action over abstraction. Aiko never sought to universalize her experience. She allowed it to inform rather than instruct. Those who encountered her later sensed restraint without knowing its origin. That restraint fostered trust. Trust enabled cooperation. Cooperation produced outcomes that appeared seamless from a distance. In reality, they were layered with unacknowledged decisions made by people who would never be named. Manila had taught her to look there. The city's lesson was not about kindness alone. It was about discernment. Who steps forward? Who steps back? Who understands when rules serve and when they obstruct? Those distinctions are rarely taught. They are learned through exposure to uncertainty managed collectively. That day provided such exposure. Aiko carried it responsibly. The others carried nothing except their routines, which continued serving others long after she left. That asymmetry was appropriate. It preserved balance. The story, stripped of spectacle, endures because it describes something recognizable. Getting lost revealed how order persists without oversight. That revelation remains relevant wherever systems confront reality unexpectedly. Over time, Aiko noticed a subtle shift within herself. She became less interested in certainty and more attentive to alignment. Policies mattered, but posture mattered more. How one entered a conversation shaped its outcome. Manila had demonstrated that entry without entitlement invited collaboration. She practiced that approach deliberately. It unsettled some peers. It empowered others. Results followed. When she encountered resistance, she assessed whether it signaled risk or fear. The distinction guided her response. That skill traced directly to reading people before titles. She never lost respect for protocol. She contextualized it. Protocol was a tool, not a shield. Used improperly, it alienated competence. Used carefully, it protected it. This nuanced understanding influenced everything she touched. Meanwhile, the city that taught her continued facing challenges without mythologizing itself. That realism appealed to her. Romantic narratives often obscure structural truth. Manila had offered truth without narrative. That was its gift. Years later, when asked in private what moment defined her approach, she mentioned being corrected gently by strangers who owed her nothing. That correction carried no accusation. It simply assumed shared responsibility. She tried to recreate that assumption in environments that resisted it. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes she did not. Failure did not discourage her. It clarified limits. The experience had never promised universal applicability. It had offered perspective. She used it accordingly, aware that perspective, unlike authority, grows when shared discreetly rather than imposed loudly. The people involved aged. Contexts shifted. The story receded from immediacy into influence. That transition mattered. Immediate stories demand reaction. Influential ones shape orientation. Manila's lesson belonged to the latter category. It influenced how Aiko evaluated risk, how Ramon mentored, how Liza conducted business, how Miriam researched systems. None of them coordinated these effects. They unfolded naturally. That lack of orchestration preserved authenticity. When Aiko eventually documented the experience privately for archival purposes, she omitted emotional framing. She listed decisions, conditions, and outcomes. The account read almost mundane. That mundanity protected it from sensationalism. It was filed away and rarely accessed. That was acceptable. Its purpose had been fulfilled elsewhere. Meanwhile, new generations navigated similar uncertainties without knowing her story. They did not need it. They needed the same conditions: opportunity to act, freedom from misinterpretation, respect for judgment. Manila continued offering those conditions unevenly, like any city. The unevenness ensured resilience. Perfect systems shatter. Adaptive ones persist. That truth, reinforced by lived experience, guided Aiko long after public attention moved elsewhere. She understood that being speechless had never been the outcome. It had been the beginning. The silence that followed was not absence. It was integration. The lesson had merged into practice. Nothing more was required. That completeness resisted narrative closure, which is why the story remains quietly unfinished. Today, the question is not whether the story is true. It is whether its implications are recognized. Getting Lost revealed more than geography. It exposed how societies function when stripped of ceremony. Manila responded with competence disguised as normalcy. That response challenged assumptions about where order originates. Aiko carried that challenge forward without attribution. The others continued their lives without interruption. That distribution of impact preserved equity. No one benefited disproportionately. No one was burdened unnecessarily. The story left no monument. That absence is its integrity. When people ask what Filipinos did next, the answer resists simplification. They did what made sense without asking who deserved it. That decision left Aiko with more than gratitude. It left her with responsibility to act differently afterward. She fulfilled it quietly. That fulfillment mattered more than recognition. Stories often seek applause. This one sought accuracy. Accuracy required restraint. The restraint honored everyone involved. Manila did not change because a princess passed through it. A princess changed because she passed through Manila. That distinction preserves dignity on both sides. It acknowledges influence without distortion. It allows the city to remain itself, unburdened by myth. It allows Aiko's experience to inform rather than define her. The speechlessness referenced in the title was temporary. What followed was articulation refined by humility. That refinement endured. It continues wherever decisions are made with awareness that help offered freely carries obligations best repaid through discretion, respect, and sustained attention to the unseen work that holds societies together.